I'm here today for Latin Business Today and the Sports Business Institute, speaking with a dear friend and certainly a radio expert, media expert, play-by-play broadcaster extraordinaire, director of sports for WGCH in Greenwich, Connecticut, and also just a wonderful play-by-play guy and broadcaster across the board, but also bigger than that, and more importantly for our conversation today, probably the foremost expert and admirer of one of the true GOAT that nobody should ever deny or argue, Vin Scully. We're obviously talking about the death of the greatest broadcaster, seriously, of all time. But Rob, welcome. Thank you. You had me on your radio show a few years ago, I guess a couple years ago, when Tom Seaver died, which was obviously near and dear to my heart. This one hits close to home for you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It has been a very emotional couple of days for me. He meant so much to my career, and I have to be upfront. I never met him, never talked to him. Just any effort to interview him never worked out. So I have to be fair. But this is a person who had a profound impact on my career and in some ways on my life as well. He was that important.
Yeah, well, that's interesting and more impressive for him to have that kind of an impact on somebody who never met him. Right. I mean, we hear stories of all these people. Oh, I met Vin here, I met Vin there. And he just seemed like just the cream of the crop, not just in terms of his broadcast talent, but as a human being.
I agree with you. And I think the mastery of a play-by-play announcer is the one who can bring you in, who can invite you into your booth, or their booth rather, or they've invited you into your home. You kind of put the two and two together. And it felt like something that many of them taught me, but especially Vin, that, I'm going to deliver the action to you. I'm going to call this game. I'm going to tell the story of the game, but I'm also going to tell stories as we go along. And that's important to be able to relay, and I say this to students all the time. The toughest sport to broadcast is baseball, because what are you doing between pitches? So I call ball one outside on a fastball. Well, now I got to tell you something. And that was Vin's mastery, his ability to tell you these stories, to take you to, the Catskills and go ice skating with Jackie and Rachel Robinson, or the Beatles being stuck at Dodger Stadium in 1966. This is all just brilliant stuff that he would mine during games. And I think that's the mastery of it, is he felt like a friend.
Yeah, he was an amazing storyteller. And as many times as I've heard him on the air, now I didn't listen to every Dodger broadcast over the years, but it never seemed that he repeated the same story twice. So, he was amazing.
Yeah, it was rare that you'd ever hear something a second time. I suppose he might break it up and retell it in a different way, but you're right overall. And he found ways to do it for things that had nothing to do with baseball. I mentioned the Beatles, but he even talked about Pearl Harbor and D-Day and ways he could spin that. And of course, meeting Babe Ruth when he was a little kid, and all these other stories that he could weave in. And then, of course, the very personal stories of players, such as the one I've heard a few times of Madison Bumgarner and his wife finding a rattlesnake one time as they were out on their property, and discovering, long story short, that they killed the rattlesnake and two jackrabbits were inside the snake. One of them, for sure, actually was alive, and they brought it back to life and released it into the wild. I think both of them might be. It's a gruesome story, but it's a beautiful story, and that's the power of the way Scully tells it.
Yeah, no, he was an amazing storyteller. But tell us more about Vin, his background. Obviously, he did more than just baseball over the years.
He did. Well, first and foremost, he was a New Yorker, and you could hear that in his voice, in his cadence over the years. Certain words he would say, you could still hear a little bit of the Bronx where he was born, and then raised in Upper Manhattan in Washington Heights, and eventually went through school, went to Fordham Prep, and at Fordham Prep is where he first tells nuns in I'm thinking the late 30s, if I recall. and this is very strange for the late 30s because he's born in 1927, but he's at Fordham Prep or before Fordham Prep, where he's going to grammar school. And he says to the nuns, I want to be a sports broadcaster. That was unheard of in the 1930s. People weren't trying, young men and certainly not young women at that time, sad to say, but they weren't thinking about being the voices of the day. But he wanted to be Graham McNamee, Bill Stern, Ted Husing. These are the people he wanted to become. And he was fascinated by a guy in Cincinnati named Red Barber, who would join Brooklyn in 1939. So there's Scully sitting under the radio in his family's house. They had a big table radio with legs, and he would listen to the crowd washing out of the speaker of college football games, and he was fascinated. He just became completely enamored with it. The nuns laughed at him, and eventually he makes it to Fordham Prep. Out of Fordham Prep, he goes to Fordham, helps start WFUV Radio, which is still on the air to this day. He is at the ground of WFUV as an early sports reporter and does some basketball. There's no proof of him ever broadcasting basketball, but he did it. Did some football as well. And we're talking the Lombardi days of Fordham. So this is all pretty remarkable stuff, Dave. And we haven't even gotten to the beginning of his actual career, which comes along when he takes a summer job in 1949 in Washington at a still active radio station, WTOP, and eventually goes from there. That was just a summer job. He just does enough nagging of all people, Red Barber, and Barber calls the family home. His redheaded mother is so thrilled that Red Skelton has called, and goes, no, Mom, that was Red Barber. Barber sends him to Boston to do a college football game where he leaves his hat and his gloves and coat in the hotel room, thinking he's going to sit in the posh press box of Fenway Park. And they put him on the roof. He never says a word. The next day, Barber gets an apology. He's so impressed, he hires Scully in 1950 to be a third voice on the Dodger broadcast, with Barber, who was the father figure, and Connie Desmond, who was the brother figure in that booth. And they were both hard on this now 22-year-old kid, waltzing right in from, Upper Manhattan.
That's great. I never heard that story about the Fenway Park thing. That's, you are clearly the go-to guy in Vin Scully, and I appreciate your time, Rob. Before we continue on Vin, and we will do more, if you wouldn't mind telling our viewers and our audience just more about yourself. I gave a very cursory overview at the beginning.
I've been a professional broadcaster, if you will, for almost 32 years. I started in 1990 doing DJ work, doing overnights on a radio station in upstate New York, and eventually made my way to WGCH, as you highlighted, and moved my way into being a sports board op at first, running the controls, which is what a board op is. You're sitting there and you're basically keeping the game on the air when you're a board operator, a studio operator. And the previous sports director left. I took over in 2000, and I've been blessed to call nearly 1,600 games since then in a variety of all kinds of sports: baseball, football, basketball, hockey, and through water polo and everything else. And it really all kinds of levels of sports, from all three divisions of college and high schools and minor league baseball. And in the back of my mind, always Vin Scully talking to me.
Yeah, listen, a great guy to emulate and a great guy to follow. And I know your philosophy, as well as mine, is sometimes you got to let the game breathe. And he was great at that. In fact, and so let's go back. So he's with the Dodgers. He's 22. And obviously what happens with the Dodgers, we all know they move to California. So I'm assuming he gets up and goes to California with them.
He does. And a key thing happens along the way. Red Barber gets into a salary dispute with Gillette, who was the national radio sponsor for the World Series. And the Dodgers didn't back him. Walter O'Malley didn't back Barber. And Barber said, okay, that's fine. Barber was a man of standards. He had his principles. And so he departed the Dodgers after that year. And Scully did the World Series at just 25 years of age. And Connie Desmond, unfortunately, had battles with alcoholism, so he made his way out of the booth as well. So here's this kid now the lead on Brooklyn Dodgers broadcasts. And when they move after 1957, Walter O'Malley is so enamored with Scully, he asks Scully to go with him along with their partner. And the two of them, Jerry Doggett and Vin Scully, move out to Los Angeles. And really, Scully teaches Southern California all about baseball, because they were really a football town more than anything. They really loved the old LA Rams of Bob Waterfield and teams like that in the early 50s. And here comes Scully, and they're at the LA Coliseum, which is monstrous for baseball. People are sitting in the Coliseum bringing the new device, a transistor radio, with them. And there's Scully doing the play-by-play, and it really changed everything.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, he certainly did have an influence on a lot of, I'm sure, fans and people in general, people like me who never had aspirations to be a broadcaster. But at the end of the day, I mean, and we mentioned it when we talk about the GOAT, and we talk about probably the greatest ever to call a game. I have to ask you, and if you have some cuts and you want to play them, feel free. But what are some of your favorite calls of all time from the man?
Ooh, there are so many. I think for me, the best one of them all is too long to get into a soundbite. And that's one argument I've had with people, because I think the greatest is 8.5 minutes of the 9th inning of Sandy Koufax's perfect game, September 9th, 1965. It is 8.5 minutes of just utter brilliance, the sheer level of detail, his giving of the time a lot, along with the date, why he's putting a timestamp on it so Koufax can have it as a souvenir to play for his family for years after. The ability to say what the crowd was, and it's so perfectly said, and I'll always quote this, 29,000 and a million butterflies, because you're so nervous in one of the rarities of baseball, a perfect game, and he's right on the doorstep. His ability in that moment to say, the crowd is seeing the game with their heart on a pitch, recognizing that the ball was a pitch was clearly a ball, but the whole crowd wanted it to be a strike. The boys straining against the fence in the bullpen to get a closer view. All of this is going on, and how the mound at Dodger Stadium is the loneliest place in the world right now. It's utter poetry, David.
Well, that's really exactly right. Yeah, it's a great way to put it, because he was just not just the way he delivered a sentence or a statement. He must have been just an amazing writer, because he just really painted the word picture, and also just put it in just the perfect way, as you're saying.
He really did. So to play you just the last out, which is what I did on my show yesterday, my radio show doubleheader that I do on WGCH, it really doesn't give you the whole story. You need to hear all 8 minutes. So I have all students listen to that every time. And I try to say to them, don't look at the video, because there is video, but it's just still pictures. There is no video of that 9th inning. It doesn't exist. Wow. It's only the audio that we have, because Vin Scully was smart enough to say to an engineer back at KFI Radio, roll tape. No tape was rolling otherwise. I always say, don't worry about the images. Hear what he's saying, because it's the description you want. And I always think young broadcasters need to learn how to describe first.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Yeah, that's it. And we, in this day and age, and not to pick on many broadcasters in particular, but they just seem to be overselling and too much information and too much talking and over talking the game and really kind of screaming at you or yelling at you, which for me, just really kind of is annoying. So I don't find it, but Scully, keeping on the subject of Scully, I read your piece and it was excellent, and I wish you'd share some of that your blog, and it's good in general, but I mean this one was very interesting to me. You mentioned something about the Hank Aaron home run, the breaking of Babe Ruth's record. Why don't you share that in terms of what was going on that night?
Well, keep in mind it's April 1974, and we're at the back end of the Vietnam War. You're only about 5 or 6 years past the assassination of Martin Luther King, and really the very troubling times of the late 60s. Race is still an issue, obviously, and obviously still is in 2022, but it seems to be very hot in 1974. And here is Hank Aaron, a very decent, wonderful ball player, was never a bad man, never a bad thing to say about anybody, but he is going after the record of records. Babe Ruth's 714 home runs. Here is the white New York Yankee, who, by the way, was an early proponent for African Americans to play Major League Baseball. That doesn't get talked about a lot. Ruth had no racial issues whatsoever, actually. But that aside, supporters are going to see, well, here's the black guy trying to take the record of a white guy. It was also terrible. And so you get to that night, I believe a Monday night, and NBC is there doing TV. They make it their game of the week. Milo Hamilton is there doing Braves radio, and Vin is there doing the Dodger radio. The other calls are perfectly fine. Milo Hamilton had it in his contract that he had to be on the air for Aaron's at-bat to break the record, which just kind of goes against things. But okay, there's Vin. Vin, working alone, gives the call. First, he kind of chides Al Downing for his first pitch, not criticizing him, Dave, but kind of saying Al has to remain a professional and ignore the crowd in the magnitude of this moment.
Right.
And so the next pitch is a fastball up and in, and Hammer and Hank hammers it out. It's gone. 2-run homer. Scully reminds you, by the way, that's the tying run in the game. Never forgetting the game. But here it is. The moment has happened. It's 715, and Scully calls it, steps up, leaves the microphone, and goes and gets a drink of water, just so the crowd can be heard. It goes on, I have read, for well over a minute and a half, if not longer.
Wow.
Edited versions, you don't get to hear it go that long.
Mm-hmm.
But the real version apparently goes that long to give Aaron the time to get around the bases, get to home plate, hug his parents, hug his teammates, and begin to finally feel the relief and smile. And it's just so marvelously described in the aftermath by Scully, who goes on and says, consider the circumstances. I'm paraphrasing. A black man is getting a standing ovation in the Deep South for breaking the record of an all-time great. And he doesn't come right out and say, breaking a white man's record. You don't need to. Everyone knows who Babe Ruth is. It's brilliantly orchestrated and delivered. And that's the preeminent call, in my opinion, of really a groundbreaking moment. Yeah.
Well, he was just sensational. Obviously, he also did some pro football too, right? And had some good calls there.
Yeah, people don't talk about it as much. He did do football for about eight seasons on CBS, and he also did the Masters. He was the lead golf guy, and he did some tennis as well. Also, that doesn't get discussed, but he did do golf both on CBS. And then he shifted over to NBC, and he was doing the Skins game later on and some of those events. But it was always good to see him. And he was, kind of fun in those moments. There's audio and video of, I believe it was Rick Massengale was the golfer. He couldn't get out of what was basically a pothole bunker that went on and on and on. And he's telling it as if he's Shakespeare, just describing the detail. The poor Rick Massengale continuing to dig out, and his caddy is saying, "You're on your own, boss." And then eventually, when he gets out, Scully goes, "Huzzah!" And out he comes. His football work was excellent. Yep. His most famous call being his last call, the 49ers and the Cowboys in the NFC Championship game, and of course, the Joe Montana to Dwight Clark catch at Candlestick Park. Cowboys had a chance to go on and win that game. It didn't happen. It created the 49ers dynasty and just the very end. Now, what had happened in the process of that, and that's the last football game Scully ever called, and the last time he ever worked on CBS, but in the process, the early part of that season, Vin was teamed up with an upstart analyst who had done some work initially with guys like Bob Costas. The guy's name was John Madden. And he had Madden, CBS had Madden and Scully do the first 8 games of the year. And then Swap and Pat Summerall worked the rest of the season with him. Vin worked with the great Hank Stram. CBS, led by Terry O'Neill, who is a Greenwich, Connecticut guy. And I will tell you this because I've met Terry and I broadcast his son's football games. Terry had the duty of telling Vin, you're not getting the Super Bowl job. We're going to go with Pat and John moving forward. You would stay on our number 2 team. CBS wanted to give him a big contract. NBC came along and went, I want to do baseball. And that was it. Vin moved over. You know what? It worked out great for everybody. Vin would have been great on the Super Bowl. No question. I have full confidence. Madden still would have been Madden, but we get Madden and Summerall, and we get Vin Scully and Joe Garagiola over on NBC for the next roughly decade doing baseball. I think it all turned out fine.
Turned out great. And obviously his first love is baseball. I mean, I would say, venture to guess that. And we're talking about the great, the GOAT, Vin Scully, with Rob Adams, who is also in his own sense, one of the best of the best in terms of broadcasting and people that I know, and appreciate his time today. We'll wrap it up here in a second, but I just want to ask Rob a couple more questions about Vin. Obviously, Vin, obviously a storyteller, clearly knowledgeable of the game. He did a lot, and you educate me, because I don't think he had a color guy on his broadcasts for the Dodgers. Has that always been the case, or was that just a recent thing?
Yeah, he always worked alone on Dodgers games all the way back to 1950. Going back to Barber, they had a tendency to let Barber do his thing, then Scully would do an inning, then Connie Desmond. They'd shift around like that. He did the same thing with Jerry Doggett, Ross Porter in later years, and others. Always worked Dodger games alone. Really, the only way Vinny had a partner was if he was doing a national game, such as football, such as golf, such as baseball. Then he would work with a variety of people. Go find the way he handles Alex Hawkins, who was an old football player. Go watch how he handles a situation with him in a football game between the Vikings and Cowboys. Hawkins makes a really awkward reference to Roger Staubach, the great, of course, Captain America quarterback, and the way he runs. And it got him fired in a whole different era, got Hawkins fired. Then nonchalantly says something about, how many hits to the head have you taken? Just enough to get the point across to say, wow, that was really bad what you just said. Yeah. And as a result, that's very marvelously handled by him in a difficult spot. So yeah, he worked with Jim Brown. He worked with George Allen. He did football with, as I mentioned, Alex Hawkins, Hank Stram. And later on, Joe Garagiola, Tom Seaver. He did a year with Tom Seaver in '89. Worked with a lot of different people, but he was a solo broadcaster. In fact, to this day, if I'm working a game alone, someone inevitably tells me I'm Scullying the game.
Yeah, nice. Right. By the way, there's somebody over your shoulder. I think he's listening to you there. If you could bend over a little bit so we can see the back of his head.
Yeah, let me shift out of the way so you can see the guy back here. That is
Vin. There he is.
That is Vin.
That was the
night that John Wooden died. John and Vinny were neighbors at one time.
Okay.
In Brentwood, I believe, when Vin had one of his first apartments after moving to LA, and they became neighbors and pretty good friends. And that's the night they remembered him at Dodger Stadium.
It would make sense, a lot of sense to me personally, being a big fan of John Wooden and his philosophies and the type of person he was, that they would be friends. It would just make it's just perfect synergy there.
Yeah, LA's been very, very blessed with great broadcasters. Not just Vin, Chick Hearn, Bob Miller, who did the Los Angeles Kings for many years, off the top of my head, and not to forget another one of my heroes, Dick Enberg.
Right, and Al Michaels is a California guy too, right? I think but.
Al was a little more Bay Area based, some Southern Cal. He grew up listening to Vin. And if you listen to Al, you can hear the Vin influence. There's no question.
Yeah. But here's the thing, Rob, and in this day and age, and it's obviously annoying to us, well, to me, and I'm sure to you, everybody now with Twitter and social media has an opinion and has a comment about everything, right? Mm-hmm. I don't need to know everybody's opinion, but it seems to me, and this predates social media, that if two guys are watching their teams in the Super Bowl or playoffs or the World Series, one guy will have a take that the broadcasters are pulling for the other team, right? And and this guy, no, they're clearly anti this or they're clearly anti that. They're rooting for this team, they're rooting for that team. And as far as I know, and you can you can drill down and say, well, Jack Buck is a Cardinals announcer, so clearly he's pulling for the Cardinals, or Joe Buck, same thing. And guys get ridiculed all the time. I mean, it must be brutal, but it seems to me, and I'm sure he had his fair criticism in that way too, Ben, but it seems like a guy who was predominantly known for one team, the Dodgers, but was universally loved by all fans. I mean, that's got to be pretty rare.
It is pretty rare. I think smarter fans take a moment and recognize that, okay, they really don't have a bias. At the end of the day, we don't really care that much. It pays our bills, sure. I'm happy when the football teams or the teams that I cover win because I get to do more games. That's the joy of it for me. But on the air, I'm going to call it as I call it. I'm going to call it pretty straight. And that was something Vin learned from Barber. Barber said to him, don't get too close to the players. So he didn't hang in the locker room a lot. He didn't hang down on the field too much. He did just enough to go down and get whatever information he needed, say the hellos he needed to, and then that was it. It didn't kind of color his description later on. He played it very down the middle. And you listen to a lot of those calls, you won't hear particular excitement necessarily for the Dodgers any more than you'd hear excitement if it was the Giants, God forbid, because they're so hated in LA, Padres, anyone else, it didn't matter. That was Vin. That's what made him so great, not only for the Dodgers, but on a national stage.
Yeah. Great stuff, my friend. Anything else you want to include or say about the greatest of all time? It's just proof that even living legends die, right?
They do. He did so much. We didn't even go through the latter stage of his career from the after 89 through the 90s into right up until he retires just 6 years ago after, the 2016 season. It just speaks that what a amount of greatness there is over 67 years with the Dodgers, everything he did, what a humanitarian he was in his own small way. He wasn't flashy. How he handled things. His speech after 9/11, just very subtle and with a heavy heart. We dust ourselves off and get back to work.
Yeah.
He was, in a lot of ways, the voice of baseball, in a lot of ways, the voice of sports. And with him goes really a golden era. And there's certainly, I'm grateful. I'm grateful we lived in a time of Vin Scully. I'm sad that it's over.
Right. And I'm sorry for you, for your sorrowful heart. And we're all, it's a sad time. And, but we are, it's our job really to keep his legacy, his legend alive. Not that we need to do that, but I think this is part and parcel with that. And I'd like to, with these Latin Business Today videos and Sport Business Institute as well, I like to do a little write-up, but I can't do any better than you've already done. So with your permission, I'd like to repurpose your blog for the write-up portion of this segment.
Sure.
And just obviously give you the credit for that. And then because nobody knows broadcasting or Vin Scully better than this man. And I thank him for his time. Rob Adams, thank you.
Dave, my pleasure. Love doing it.